All right, it looks like we are all here. So let me do a brief introduction, and our director in the Center for the Political Future, Kami, is going to give a few comments, then we'll turn it over to the team for the presentation. And just so everyone has a sense of how today's going to flow, the team will go ahead and present for roughly 40 minutes or so, and that will give us the remainder of the time for a question and answer period, which there should be plenty of time for that. We always defer to our partners in no particular order. So I'll just sort of work at moderating it so that we have some semblance of organization. But really, it's an opportunity for Nick and Avery and Danielle just to engage with the students, ask them questions, and get maybe a more in-depth discussion on the topic. So before I have Kami say a word or two, I would just like to say thank you to all three of our providers. Just by way of background, we have been running this program, I want to say, for about 7 or 8 years now. And unlike our traditional 395 program, where we work with several hundred internship providers here in Los Angeles, and we, in a normal semester, place people in offices to get that internship experience, our research internship program is incredibly heavily dependent on our providers to give their time and their energy. And to be totally frank, a lot of providers, and it's understandable, can't always do that. So this program doesn't happen without people like you all. And so we really, really appreciate the time and efforts, because what we see from the student perspective is the incredible knowledge that they gain on a specific issue, in this case, LAUSD policy, and just that sort of real world experience that is sometimes hard to get in other settings. So on behalf of the center, we really appreciate all the time that all three of you have given. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Kami just for a quick second, and then we'll turn to our presentation.
Thank you, Professor Auerbach, much appreciated. Nick, nice to see you. I think you and I have more mutual connections on LinkedIn than almost anybody else that I'm connected to on LinkedIn. So I'm very grateful to you in your office for accepting USC for this very distinguished position to be able to do research alongside you. Art and the students know this, but I'm not sure if your office is aware, Nick, but the Center for the Political Future has existed in some form or another since 1978 at USC. Originally was called the Institute of Politics, and then it became the Unruh Institute of Politics. And in 2017, when we got Bob Schrum, it became the Center for the Political Future. The whole purpose of this center is to make politics practical so we can train the next generation of political and civic leaders. To me, this class, Poli-Sci 395, is perhaps the most practical expression of that, where students can take real world problems and try to devise real world solutions. So it's not just a theoretical exercise in a classroom, they can change policy. I think that's a very powerful experience for a lot of these students. When we asked students at USC, which themes or topics would you like Poli-Sci 395 to focus on? Our number one topic was education. It's hugely important to the students. And then when the opportunity arose with your office, it was just a perfect match. We're so grateful that we're able to work together in this capacity. I had the pleasure and privilege of listening to these students make their presentations a few days ago. I thought it was outstanding. I'm sure you will too. And because of that, I will not be joining for the remainder of today's session. I really just wanted to say hello. I have got, unfortunately, to go onto another call where I have to explain why the USC Dornsife poll, like every other national poll, got it wrong. So we've got some explaining to do, and that's what I'll be doing. But I want to keep the door open with your office. We'd love to work with you down the road. You've been very generous with your time and your resources, and hopefully we can work together to solve some of these problems within the Los Angeles community and education. Thank you for all your good work. And I now turn it over to our students, who will be giving you, I think, a really exceptional presentation here. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Kami, and please, give my best to Bob. He's a close friend, and also I'll just say I was involved with the Institute of Politics in my undergrad. Actually, remember vividly this time period because it was 2004, and so John Kerry had just lost, and I guess the benefit was that we had a lot of Democrats in exile who were able to come and
Right.
teach us. But it was kind of what launched my interest. So grateful to the students, and yeah, look forward to continuing to work together. So.
Oh, excellent.
Right, I think we'll go ahead and turn it over to the team. Alin, take it away.
Good morning. My name is Alin, and we would like to welcome you all and thank board member Melvoin for being in attendance. Throughout the semester, we've researched universal preschool, more specifically, how to bring it to Los Angeles. I will talk about why universal preschool should be implemented. Erica will discuss different methods of funding it. Ashleigh will speak on best practices, and Stuart will express concerns and potential alternatives to universal preschool. Then Gloria and Sarah will discuss teacher recruitment through affordable housing. Next slide, please. We believe that the gap in preschool education propagates the endless cycle of inequality in America. Only about 45 to 50% of low-income 4-year-olds attend preschool nationally, as opposed to about 69% of 4-year-olds from high-income families. As you can see in this graph, as socioeconomic status goes up, preschool participation goes up at a fairly high rate in a fairly linear fashion. This is a major long-term contributor to wealth inequality in America and serves to widen gaps in educational achievement. According to the National Institute for Early Education Research, in 2018, only 41% of 4-year-olds were in a publicly funded pre-K program. This means that many families have to pay for private school pre-K, and there's simply not enough access to public pre-K options in America. Next slide, please. There are both educational and economic benefits to gain from implementing universal preschool. A study by the University of North Carolina showed kids who attended a high-quality preschool program were 11% more likely to graduate high school. They were also 8% less likely to be held back or placed in special education. Furthermore, one study from the NIER found that after implementing UPK programs in Tulsa and Boston, achievement gaps between white and minority kindergartners closed immensely. The reading gap closed by 98% and the math gap closed by half. We believe this is very important in California since the math gap in the state by race is 25% and the reading gap is about 30%. So there's a lot of progress to be made in those areas. And universal preschool in Los Angeles will help make the city more educationally equitable. Economically speaking, for every dollar invested in preschool education, there's a return on investment to the public of $12.90, a lot of which comes from tax revenue from the increased wages that correlate with high school graduation rates. A more tangible benefit comes from what has happened in Washington, D.C. Since D.C. began offering universal preschool in 2009, the city's maternal labor force participation rate has increased by about 12 percentage points. And women and families with incomes below the federal poverty level saw 15% increases in labor participation. Thus, giving preschool to all children in Los Angeles will give more mothers the chance to enter the workforce and build a living for themselves and contribute to the city's economy. Next slide, please. Universal pre-K is steadily becoming more a part of the national policy conversation, but it's clearly taken a stronger hold at state and local levels. Some states like Vermont and Oklahoma have implemented it at a statewide level, while some large cities have undertaken the task on their own, including New York City, which has 70,000 4-year-olds enrolled in pre-K and makes it available to all families. We feel that New York is most comparable to Los Angeles because where LAUSD will likely have to implement it at a citywide level. And going further into New York City, in 2013, they were at just 19,000 preschool students, showing they can scale. It is possible to scale up a universal preschool program very, very quickly. Another interesting note is that they pay their preschool teachers at an average of about $60,000 per year, which is equivalent to the pay of their elementary school teachers. Meanwhile, according to the U.S. Department of Education, the median preschool teacher salary is about 52% of the median elementary school teachers. So in order to ensure quality control in New York, they decided it was best to pay their elementary school teachers or their preschool teachers the same price as elementary school teachers and have higher quality staff and higher quality learning to make sure that the preschool program was worthy of being implemented. Now looking at California, Governor Newsom has proposed yearly increases to the state budget to eventually have every 4-year-old in pre-K down the road, starting with a 3-year plan to open 30,000 spots for low-income 4-year-olds. Obviously, it's something he ran on, a part of the platform he ran on for governor, and we believe that can be taken advantage of when looking for funding. Looking at LAUSD, there are about 40 to 45,000 LAUSD students enrolled in some sort of early education, including about 30K in LAUSD's transitional kindergarten program. And our research shows that 35% of Los Angeles children eligible for preschool are not enrolled, meaning a good estimate is that we need 60 to 65,000 seats to ensure everyone who needs preschool in LAUSD will have access to it. Thank you for your time, and Erica will now discuss funding this program.
Hello, good morning. My name is Erica, and I will be leading our foray into funding. Obviously, the coronavirus sort of poses a difficult challenge in terms of funding. However, I've tried to derive some ideas that can lead us through this crisis and hopefully move beyond in order to fund an excellent universal pre-K program. All right, next slide, please. So here we have 3 models of funding. These have been taken from national programs across the country, and we see all 3 of these represented in one way or another. So I'm going to discuss which might be the best option for LAUSD. First, we have our district-only funding model, which, as the name implies, only funds new and existing programs established by LAUSD. Now, these can be established in community centers or in elementary schools. However, the defining characteristic is that they are run and operated by LAUSD. Now, this sort of model can increase program quality within the district exponentially. However, one of the downsides is that it can create a crowding out effect with other providers, including community-based organizations and federal Head Start programs. Moving to a mixed funding model, that, as the name implies, funds programs established by LAUSD and assists and subcontracts to other providers, including community-based organizations, federal Head Start programs, and potentially state-run schools. This ensures a cohesion in curricula and combats disparities that exist between these programs. Right now, the disparities are pretty high, with district-run programs often being higher quality than community-based organizations and other programs. However, the major downside to the mixed funding model is certification uncertainties with teachers. There's not a lot of cohesion on that front currently, so that can be a potential roadblock. And moving to the right to the scholarship model, these are funds that go directly to parents from the district in the form of scholarships or subsidies. We've mostly seen this in smaller or more spread out districts. So my opinion is that it wouldn't work very well in a large district with so many students. It does raise some concerns about the subjectivity of the criteria used and the administrative costs of giving out all of these scholarships. My recommendation would be a mix of the first 2, either the district only or the mixed funding model. Those have proven to be really successful in large cities such as Chicago and New York. All right, next slide, please. So right now we're going to look at the current state of funding and where we expect it to go. So if we turn, these are graphics taken from this year's LAUSD budget. If you look at the pie chart to the circled area, the current early education fund is $182 million, only 1% of the budget. With a targeted or universal pre-K program, we expect enrollment numbers to go up exponentially. And we would also want to adjust this early education fund to reflect an increase in enrollment. Based off of case studies, the ideal spending per student is $12,000 to $18,000. If we turn our attention to the graph at the bottom, we'll see that current spending for early education per pupil is about $26,000 to $27,000. However, enrollment is only at 9,000. So with this number, we get some economies of scale at play, where if we see an increase in enrollment, we'll see a per pupil cost that goes down. So to serve 60,000 students would cost between $72 million and $1 billion. Now that's a really big, scary number. However, it's something that is feasible in the future. Let's look at the next slide. So here are some ideas about where funding can come from. If we look at the left, we'll see unassigned funds. According to budgets, that's projected to be 36.6 million in the year 2022-23. Obviously, that's not even close to 72 million or 1 billion. However, 36 million is enough to open up more than 2,000 additional pre-K seats. Obviously, it's good to have some unassigned funds around. However, this is a good cause to put them towards, and it helps begin piloting a program. If we move to the right, we see that we can use funds from the State Education Protection Account. As you all know, these funds require certification via a community, open to the community meeting. I think it would be politically expedient to use these funds for universal pre-K. It's very easy to get behind and rally support for. Moving below, it's possible to propose a new citywide tax on high earners in order to supplement funding for universal pre-K. Moving to the right, as we know, Governor Newsom is a proponent of universal pre-K. And so there is a possibility to advocate for state legislation allowing average daily attendance funds to go towards public pre-K. This would be a major step in implementing universal pre-K in the state and something that would be very beneficial for these programs. And in the upper right, we say that there are economic uncertainty reserves for LAUSD. Those are being used right now to fight COVID-19 and to recover. That's the sort of economic uncertainty that these funds are for. However, there's sure to be some funds left over, which can be used to help students via a universal pre-K program. All right, thank you. Now we're going to go to Ashleigh, where she is going to give us some case studies.
Sorry guys, I had myself muted. Good morning everyone, my name is Ashleigh Grindon. Today I'll be going over best practices for universal pre-K using a case study approach. The states I will be using are Georgia, Florida, and Oklahoma, followed by Washington, D.C. and New York City. The key themes of each state or city's campaign for universal pre-K are successful civil engagement, a well-performing economy, and an influential political leader to push the legislation through. Next slide, please. My first slide will be going over Georgia, Oklahoma, and Florida. While these states are much smaller than the city of LA, there are still valuable elements of each state's road to universal pre-K that I would like to highlight. So first, Georgia. In 1990, Georgia's governor, Zell Miller, wanted a way to support education without increasing taxes, thus alarming Georgia's conservative voters. So he established a lottery in Georgia to entirely fund the state's universal pre-K as well as several college scholarships. The pilot program began in 1992 using a targeted preschool approach, meaning pre-K was implemented in Georgia's poorest areas. It was available across a variety of settings, including public schools, private childcare centers, faith-based organizations, Head Start agencies, institutions of higher education, and military facilities. However, after a couple of years, Georgians started to see this targeted approach as a social welfare program and no longer supported it. So in 1994, Governor Miller removed the income limits on the universal pre-K, so it was now open to every 4-year-old, and the lottery was doing so well, it was able to cover this upscale. Thus, in 1995, Georgia's preschool program became the nation's very first state-funded universal pre-K program. Today, Georgia's program serves more than 80,000 kids and spends almost $4,000 per child per year. Moving on to Oklahoma. Unlike Georgia and New York, where the development of universal pre-K was connected to a popular election and received lots of media attention, the development of universal pre-K in Oklahoma evolved much quieter through small incremental changes. The program first began in 1980 with a small pilot program funded by state legislature where children were enrolled on a first come, first served basis. The program was very small with only 10 districts participating. Then in 1993, there was a lack of attendance in kindergarten classrooms, which led to the 4s in K initiative, where Oklahoma legislators allowed 4-year-olds to integrate into kindergarten classes. This incentive was eventually struck down, but it paved the way for Oklahoma universal pre-K to be almost completely based out of their public schools, which is a very interesting trend. So for Oklahoma, in terms of funding, there is no separate funding for pre-K. It's built into the public school funding. Therefore, Oklahoma universal pre-K is much less vulnerable to budget cuts. Today, Oklahoma's pre-K serves more than 50,000 kids, which is 76% of their 4-year-olds, and they spend roughly $3,600 per student per year. Then in Florida, in 1987, Florida established its pre-kindergarten early intervention program to serve 3 and 4-year-olds. However, 2 state legislators felt that this was not doing enough for kids. So in the late 90s, they decided to pursue a voter initiative to amend Florida's state constitution to require the provision of voluntary preschool for all 4-year-olds. The first thing that these legislators did was to identify public support and found that 2/3 of statewide voters supported the idea of a state-funded voluntary preschool. The first thing they did to kick off their campaign was to create a series of community summits centered around universal pre-K involving educators, parents, doctors, child care providers, and community leaders. Arguably, the most impressive thing this campaign did was generate $1.8 million just for the campaign. $1.4 million was spent on petitions, and the remaining $400,000 was spent on media marketing. They got nearly 50,000 signatures statewide, and by July 2002, the Universal Pre-K program was implemented. Today, Florida's Universal Pre-K program serves 77% of their 4-year-olds and spends roughly $2,200 per child per year. Next slide, please. Now I'll be talking about Washington, D.C., which has arguably the most comprehensive and truly universal pre-K program in the country. The campaign strategy for implementation was one of the most elaborate, interconnected, and expansive campaigns in the country. As you can see by the flowchart, it was kicked off by several key blocks and grants towards universal pre-K in the years 2000 to 2002. The campaign was then able to take advantage of a huge citywide election and got all candidates that year to support universal pre-K and make it a part of their plan if elected. This led to the election of DC Council Chair Vincent Gray, who was one of the main pushers in legislation for universal pre-K. While this was going on, there was a major grassroots and grass tops campaign in the work. With Grass Tops, the campaign was able to connect influential business leaders and political figures and get them behind universal pre-K through councils, committees, summits, and other community engagement activities, while simultaneously they were organizing an extraordinarily expansive and in-depth grassroots campaign, also using committees, summits, media outreach, and e-communications. One of the most influential aspects of DC's universal pre-K program that will be especially useful to LA was their media outreach as a way to mobilize their poor neighborhoods through radio shows, newspapers, and community events. Because these neighborhoods were going to be the first to receive universal pre-K, it was important that those parents trusted the system and wanted to participate in it. Today, DC enrolls over 6,000 3 and 4-year-olds and spends roughly $18,000 on each child per year. Next slide, please. New York's journey to universal pre-K dates back to the 1940s, though it never really got anywhere until 1997, when the Speaker of Assembly passed a major education reform bill because the city had a booming economy at the time. Unfortunately, at the time the pilot program was supposed to roll out, 9/11 happened, severely inhibiting New York's economy, and then it wasn't until 2014 when Mayor de Blasio made universal pre-K an implemental part of his campaign that this issue came to the forefront again. He strategically made pre-K universal from the get-go to appease New York City's politically influential upper middle class. Though this program today only serves 40% of the city's 3 and 4-year-olds, it's a fairly comprehensive plan. They have a program for 6 weeks to 2-year-olds called Early Finder, and an entirely separate program for 3-year-olds called 3K. To be eligible for these 2 programs, a child must meet at least one of a list of requirements. A few examples of these requirements are if a child's in foster care, if the child has an active welfare case, or if the family's income levels meet certain requirements. There is universal pre-K for 4-year-olds, and it's run out of 4 key places, which, as you can see on the map, are pre-K centers and district schools, which account for most of New York City's pre-K programs, followed by early education centers, then charter schools. Today, New York City's universal pre-K program serves roughly 70,000 3 and 4-year-olds, which is very comparable to LA's target goal of 60,000 4-year-olds. So next we will hear from Stuart, who will speak on the fallbacks of universal pre-K as well as alternate practices. Thank you so much.
Hey everyone, thanks for being here, and I'll get right into it. So next slide, please. So when it comes to concerns, they generally boil down to 3 things: cost, scale, and mixed results. When it comes to cost, it's pretty clear. Universal pre-K is very expensive, and there's a concern that when either you don't have enough money or when you're trying to spread the money thinly amongst a lot of kids, which would be happening in LAUSD given its size, you're going to have an underfunded program, which time and time again has either produced marginal results, no results, or negative results, which is something obviously we'd like to avoid. When it comes to cost, there's also a concern that if you're directing hundreds of millions of dollars towards pre-K, that's hundreds of millions of dollars that could have been directed towards, low-income kids in K-12, homeless kids in K-12, foster youth, etc. So, obviously, K-12 is also in need of reform. So there's a concern there that the money is not being put in the right place. There's also a COVID-related concern. The district will likely have less money because of COVID. And in addition, there's going to be more kids that are at need because of the economic damage caused by the pandemic. And most likely the in-need condition of children will be exacerbated because of COVID. When it comes to scale, unfortunately, there's a rich world of failed pilot projects, and pilot projects that are promising sometimes fail for a variety of reasons. It could either be, people perform better when they know they're being evaluated, or too many connections develop when a project scaled. So we're going to look at two examples. One is not yet like a failed pilot project. I would not call it that. And the other is a little more disturbing, and that's the example you see there with Quebec. So with Head Start, we're not calling this a failed pilot project. However, there are some ways, some unforeseen shortcomings that arose when it scaled. And just, one example of that is it's been difficult to maintain kind of the passion and enthusiasm of a really small cadre of researchers and specialists that Head Start's pilot programs originally had. And another effect we've seen is Head Start now recruits teachers who just have associate's degrees and people who are just looking for a job, which is fine. But when it comes to universal pre-K, you would hope that the program is high quality, and you can't really have a truly high quality program when the teachers are people who are just looking for jobs rather than people who specialize in teaching and whose, kind of life's goal is to teach kids. And now scale also brings us to the example of Quebec, which kind of segues us into mixed results. So in the 90s, the Canadian province of Quebec, which has about 8 million people, kind of comparable to LA County, they implemented universal pre-K. And unfortunately, it was kind of a disaster. What ended up happening was kids' aggression increased who went into the program. Their motor skills actually declined in a statistically significant way. Anxiety increased among them by 60%. Even things like illness increased among them, and this was compared to kids that did not go into the program. And the results were so negative that in 2006, the National Bureau of Economic Research actually, in their monthly publication, published a story called "Why Canada's Universal Pre-K Program Hurt Canada's Kids." So Quebec kind of provides a cautionary tale of why universal pre-K doesn't always work and why there's actually mixed results. So when it comes to the concern of mixed results, again, it's kind of clear if you're going to put a lot of money into a program, you want to make sure it works. And with universal pre-K, like Alin said, there's a lot of studies that show elements of it are really positive and productive, but that's not the case everywhere. So for example, the evidence of cognitive benefits, and that's cognitive benefits are things like reading and math and writing. That evidence is somewhat underwhelming in some studies, and they also appear to fade out in some cases as kids go through the K-12 system. There's also the evidence of social benefits, like the chance you don't go to prison or the chance you get a college degree. That's based on a relatively small sample size. In addition, in some studies, like the Brookings Institute did a study of state pre-K programs, and they found that they didn't enhance student achievement meaningfully or at all. And in a meta-analysis of 13 early childhood literacy programs, they failed to find any evidence that they had an effect on kids' language ability or print-based abilities. So next slide, please. So in light of that, if there's all these issues, you'd like to know if there's an alternative. And that alternative is family support. And we recognize this is something that's not within LAUSD's jurisdiction or ability to implement, but we do think it's a policy you should be aware of and something you might want to advocate for or increase the visibility of. And family support is basically the idea of rather directing money to the school, you'd give it to the family. So that could be a tax credit, a child allowance, or some kind of childcare subsidy. The benefits of it are, first of all, it's cheaper. So this policy is actually used in almost all EU countries and Canada. And rather than spending, 12 to 18,000 per student, like you do in universal pre-K programs, you only end up spending between like 2,000 is the low point and 5,000 is usually the max. So it's way cheaper. And in addition to being cheaper, it's also proven to be more effective. So in most of those EU countries that implement it, the child poverty rate is less than half of the United States. And in a Chalkbeat study of about 20 income boosting programs, they found that those income boosting programs benefits regularly outweighed the impact of either having an excellent versus average teacher or the impact of universal pre-K and not having universal pre-K. And lastly, they're just more supported than universal pre-K. That's not to say universal pre-K isn't a popular policy, but family support is even more popular. About 80% of Americans support it, and that's good for 90% of Democrats and even 60% of Republicans. So next slide, please. However, even in light of all those issues that were pointed out and the alternative, we still think there's a place for universal pre-K. Like pre-K, especially in the instance of kids in need, is better than no pre-K. So this is our proposal. It would be a series of targeted universal pre-K programs for LAUSD's 4-year-olds that would be rolled out over the period of about 5 years, eventually encompassing the entire district. LA's areas with the highest proportion of impoverished children would be served first during years 1 through 3, and that's areas like Boyle Heights, where 55% of kids are in poverty or under the poverty line, South Central and Watts, 49%, pretty disturbing numbers, and clearly those kids should be served first. And this also mirrors, this is not some like radical policy, this is the policy that Chicago used, where they rolled it out to the entirety of Chicago, but started with low-income areas first. And actually Portland, only a couple days ago, just passed universal pre-K, and they're doing the same thing. They're rolling it out to the city's poorest children first. And this also has the benefit of being most effective. Lastly, teachers should be paid about 90% of what LAUSD elementary school teachers are already paid. This is also something that Portland's doing, because one of the key things towards maintaining quality is ensuring that, people that are trained want to go into the program and that they stay into the program, which is hard to do when they're not being paid enough. And lastly, the program should be run out of a combination of formal early education centers, district schools, and transitional kindergarten programs. And this is something that we put in to kind of avoid an issue that's arisen to New York, where because of the difficulty to buy like property and attain property, the programs disproportionately serve rich and middle-class kids as opposed to poor kids, just because the property in those areas was more widely available because those areas weren't as densely built. So that's why that's there. And lastly, we heard that Nick liked metaphors, so I'm going to use a basketball metaphor to describe this one, if you're up for it. So we think that the alternative to this, which would just be, universal pre-K for everyone immediately, that's kind of like the 2020 Los Angeles Clippers of universal pre-K programs, because it would cost a lot of money for something that you're not sure is going to work and probably won't work. Whereas this program is kind of like the 1992 dream team of universal pre-K programs, because we're simply just trying to avoid issues that have arisen in the past. The reason it's targeted is because studies repeatedly show that universal pre-K has a disproportionate effect a good positive effect on poor children, actually. And this is because of a variety of reasons, probably just because middle class children, rich children, they would have universal pre-K anyways, whereas poor children would not. So it's a program that you're pretty sure would probably work, and it's also more cost effective because you're not spending almost $1 billion up front. You could divide that over about 5 years, and you could also adjust your cost estimate based on how the program is running year to year. And lastly, we know that there's an interest in a sliding scale, and we thought about that idea a lot. Overall, in the end, though, we came to the conclusion that it just might not be the best idea because, first of all, it probably wouldn't be popular simply because people don't like paying into a program that other people don't have to. And it would also decrease the probability that they feel invested in it. They might just simply say, why would I pay for this when I could pay for a pre-K program that I know about and I can afford already? And lastly, a sliding scale might make it really difficult to anticipate enrollment numbers. You might either have too many seats that are open, or you might not create enough seats. And that's actually a problem that we saw in Quebec, where they could not create enough seats. So again, that would make the logistics difficult if you can't anticipate how many kids are going to go into the program. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to affordable housing.
Hello, my name is Sarah, and I'll be addressing why we need teacher housing, the benefits, along with the discussing the current situation with funding. Next slide, please. Why we need teacher housing. So currently there is a nationwide teacher shortage, and according to the Learning Policy Institute, also known as the LPI, the US was short roughly 100,000 teachers just of last year. And in 2016, 75% of 211 California school districts reported a teacher shortage. There's also high turnover rates as they pose problems such as the average turnover rate in California alone is 17.5%. And this is very costly to school districts as the US spends nearly $2.2 billion on teacher recruitment and retention efforts. And as you can see from the graph on the right, according to the California Public Employees and Teachers Retirement System, in California, teacher representing the blue line on the very bottom, turnover is higher than any other public sector workers, such as the other lines that you see representing the police officers, firefighters, and state employees. This contributes to the overall productivity loss and potential lower quality of education for students. Teachers also face a high cost of rent burden. And once again, according to LPI, nationally, it'll take more than 40% of a typical teacher's salary to pay the median rent. There's also a large disparity between teacher salary and rental housing costs in Los Angeles. And unfortunately, housing becomes a drain on salaries as LAUSD entry-level teachers typically spend more than 50% of their income on rent. And lack of affordable housing is one reason teachers leave their profession or leave a district with high costs of living, which is why overall it's important to think about the intersections between housing and teaching. Next slide, please. Thus, the benefits look promising as affordable housing incentives will recruit and retain teachers. Though LAUSD has been showing promising signs of high teacher retention rate, allowing for more affordable housing is considered to be an important factor on influencing a teacher's decision to be in and remain in their profession. And as you can see from the graph on the right, according to the Learning Policy Institute, as I've highlighted on the very bottom, titled Housing Incentives, 23% of teachers who left their careers rated housing incentives to be as extremely or very important in their decision to return. And of course, like many other factors above housing incentives that have many more percentage, increasing compensation above the housing incentives in this graph may seem like the silver bullet, but we need to continually think about creative ways such as creating and pushing for more housing incentives for educators and allowing them to be in and remain in the profession. And this incentive will also open up opportunities for more teachers of diverse backgrounds, which LAUSD is really looking into to apply and work for schools located in high cost areas, such as LAUSD. And will also promote higher teaching quality, leading to greater educational opportunities and resources for students. This will also alleviate this financial burden on teachers. They won't have to work multiple part-time jobs on top of their teaching career to make ends meet. Ensuring affordable housing will essentially alleviate the stress teachers may face during these unprecedented times. Ultimately, affordable housing will promote better quality of life for teachers. They get to live closer to their classrooms, become more engaged in their communities, and importantly, they get to cut down on their commute as longer commute times contribute to lower work output. Next slide, please. Now moving on to the current situation with funding. Before the approval of the AB 3308 bill, due to strict federal income restriction guidelines for affordable housing, teachers didn't fall into the category of the low income housing tax credit income-wise to qualify. And unable to qualify, building affordable housing specifically for teachers becomes a very big financial barrier. Main reason for why teachers do not qualify for already existing affordable housing for LAUSD educators, such as Sage Park and Selma community housing, teachers make too much to qualify for these affordable housing and instead are filled by other faculty members and not the teachers. But with the implementation of the AB 3308 bill that was recently approved on September 2020, the year of 2020, this empowers school districts to build affordable housing and also allows for the use of designated tax credits to fund affordable housing, which is crucial in expanding for more housing built specifically for teachers. Next slide, please. And now you'll hear from Gloria covering the potential types, case studies, and our policy proposals for affordable housing.
Hello. So now that Sarah's gone over just the benefits and the why of teacher housing, as well as the current funding situation we're looking at, I wanted to dive into the potential types of models and some of the case studies that I've gone through this semester. So first, I want to talk about potential types. So there's developer-driven as well as district-led housing. And in developer-driven, first, the developers actually take the initiative and come to school districts to provide affordable housing out of their own desire to make a social impact on the community. The second group we have is district-led, and within that we have three subgroups. We see sale of district property, in which the school district actually sells land that they own to developers with some restrictions that requires them to provide some portion of affordable housing for teachers. And then we have the use of ground lease, in which the school district isn't necessarily interested in selling the land. However, through a ground lease, they partner with a developer to make housing. And lastly, we have district run. In this case, land owned by the school district is used for housing developments, either by the district itself or a related foundation. Next slide, please. So I specifically focused on the use of ground lease as well as district run in the next two slides because I know LAUSD has shown interest in using a ground lease, and I thought the most probable other option was district run. So first we'll look at using a ground lease, and both of my case studies actually came from within LAUSD. We saw Sage Park Apartments and Selma Community Housing. So there was a long-term ground lease, which does have its pros in that there is a stream of income and it's fairly low touch management in that partnership with your developer. So we saw you partner with Bridge Housing and Abode Communities respectively, with rents ranging from around $425 to $1,222 at Sage Park and $550 to $1,272 at Selma. Now, like Sarah mentioned, there was the usage of LAHTC, which meant there were some strict eligibility requirements. So applicants did have to be making 30 to 60% of the average median income. And at Sage Park, while we saw a lottery system in which preference was given to LAUSD employees, at Selma, we saw 50% of the units being prioritized. Now, although we've seen both projects be really helpful for individuals struggling with rent burden, the biggest issue is that teachers have been excluded, like Sarah has mentioned, because of this strict 30 to 60% AMI requirement. So we haven't really seen any successes in teacher retention or things like that. Next slide, please. That is why I wanted to jump into district run and mention to you guys the success of Casa del Maestro in Santa Clara, California. So it was opened in 2 phases, phase 1 being in 2002, phase 2 in 2009. And the reason they did this was because they were able to save money, but it also gave them time for evaluation between the 2 phases, and it helped them decide whether or not phase 2 would even occur. So the rent on average was around 50 to 60% of the market rents in the surrounding area. And because they opted not to use LAHTC, they were able to have requirements that were a little bit more lenient. So first, they had to be employed by Santa Clara Unified for less than 10 years, be in a teaching position, and make a household income of under $136,000. They did have a limit in tenure though. So the maximum number of years that a teacher could stay was 7. However, most did decide to stay for the full term. So now moving on to the outcomes, I did mention that this was very successful, and it's still seen as one of the most successful cases of teacher housing, which is because they actually found that the attrition rate for teachers living in the development of Casa del Maestro was found by the district to be less than 1/3 of those not living there. We also saw that teachers were more likely to buy houses in the area after their stay because they were able to save on rent during those 7 years. Also, we saw that the percentage of income that was going toward rent was 29%, right under that 30% mark that I'll be talking about next. Next slide, please. So before jumping into our proposal, I did want to mention some pitfalls or some considerations that we should look at before going forward with this project. And the first being community support. This is very essential because we did see at Cupertino where a housing project fell through after it was approved. They reported that there was really unnecessary tension between the school board and the community that really took away from their focus of providing a quality education to the students there because the community members felt there was a lack of transparency and consideration for their opinions before being approved. It was more of it was never shown to them before it was approved, which I think was not very taken well by these people. Next, obviously, we're going through COVID-19, and there are a lot of issues that arise with that, and as well as the priority dilemma. Because teachers with similar salary ranges will be applying, and historically we've seen teacher housing be really popular, we have to think of how we'll decide priority. Will we use a lottery system like we saw at Sage Park, or will it be a priority system that is figured out? And next, I did want to talk about the issue of prioritizing teachers over others who lost jobs due to COVID-19. There already is this stigma or this thought that teachers aren't doing enough during this time. With students being home, I think parents aren't really seeing the impact or the effort that teachers are making. So how will we better explain and present this material in a way that is consumable for the community and makes them really on board for this issue? Next slide, please. So our proposal finally is that we suggest you use a ground lease because that is what we've seen historically with LAUSD, and that is what you guys are probably most comfortable with. However, with AB 3308 and the issues we've seen with using the 30 to 60% AMI requirement, we wanted to make the eligibility so that it was available to all teachers employed at LAUSD that qualify as cost burden families. So if you look at the chart below, the second row, you'll see that the average percent that teachers use for rent at LAUSD is 36%. And HUD defines cost burden families as being those who pay more than 30% of their income for housing. And really sadly, we see that 1 in 5, so 20% of primary teachers are burdened by housing costs nationwide. So by using this line of definition where we look at if they are a cost burden family or not, I believe that more teachers can receive this benefit of housing. Next, we did want to talk about rent duration, ensuring that there wasn't an inflation of rent throughout the duration of the leasing term, as well as setting a limitation on residency like we saw at Santa Clara, just so that as new teachers join LAUSD, they're still provided that same opportunity because wait lists have been very long in all of the case studies that I've studied. Next, we just wanted to reiterate both of our proposals, and I'll hand it over to Sarah.
Yeah, so going over our combined policy recommendations, we suggest that for universal pre-K, LAUSD will have targeted programs for Los Angeles County's 4-year-olds that are enrolled out over 5 years. Serve all 4-year-old children within the relevant targeted region. Areas such with the highest proportion of impoverished children will be served in the first during years 1 to 2, and teachers being paid at least 90% of LAUSD elementary school teacher pay. And as for affordable housing, we propose the use of ground lease and being in partnership with different developers, along with having the eligibility requirement become more lenient, making it available for all teachers who qualify as cost burden families. And lastly, we also suggest to have fixed rent costs and limitations in stay for other teachers who may apply or be in the waiting list to qualify. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for your interest and attention. And at this time, we'll move on to a time of questions.
Yay, very good. Excellent. Good job, everybody. I guess applause doesn't quite translate in a day of virtual learning, but we'll do our best. So for the remainder of our time, we have the opportunity for Nick and Danielle and Avery to ask questions. I'm happy to sort of moderate, although I think we could sort of figure out whoever one that starts. Perhaps you, Nick, if you have any questions, pose them to the entire panel. You certainly can target them to specific topics or specific individuals, but this is really just a chance to dig a little deeper and sort of have a more fulfilling discussion on all of the work that the panel did. And I think, you know, the presentation showed they did quite a bit of work. I'll turn it over to you, Nick.
Yeah, no, well, thank you. This was fascinating. I learned a lot, and credit even for the, I think the Clippers analogy, you know, even incorporates the fact that we had like kind of tarnished influence from Canada with Kawhi coming from Toronto and then the Quebec example. So that was just like icing on top. I also, you know, these were great. And we were at my team, you know, Danielle, Avery, and I were just chatting, you know, over text that we had a board meeting on Tuesday, so 2 days ago, about affordable housing. And I really think if the board, the superintendent had given your presentation, it would have passed. It failed. It was actually delayed. And part of it is because of that point about the unnecessary tension between the board and the community. You know, we have a lot of necessary tension between the board and the community. So trying to avoid any of that unnecessary tension. So this is something we'll definitely be sharing with the superintendent's team too, because this is coming, this item is coming back to the board in a month. And, you know, I think these are things that my colleagues should know. And I'm, you know, particularly appreciate the examples, the LA Unified examples. Selma is in my board district and we're proud of that. And then we opened one near you all, the Norwood Center, Learning Center, which is in University Park, I believe last year. But, you know, and I also think too, you all focus so crucially on quality around early ed. And part of that quality comes from who's teaching. And, you know, I think that's why there's synergy between these two proposals in my mind, because, you know, we want to increase access to high quality early ed. It's going to require money. Part of that comes in teacher salaries, and, you know, thinking of other fringe benefits for teachers like housing is you know, a way to maybe do that. So I mean, I do have a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to my team. But I guess on the universal pre-K one, I'm curious if you all in your research came across Prop 82. I know that back, I believe it was in 2006, there was a millionaire's tax, like a statewide tax to try to do universal pre-K that failed pretty badly. I think it was something like 60-40. And so just curious if that came up, or if you think there's appetite, or if in your research, I know you proposed kind of a city or like county-wide tax, if you saw any polling, or if you think there's any appetite potentially, based on what we saw last Tuesday in the election, like for, a tax increase for universal pre-K, either citywide or statewide.
I can field that. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that Prop 82 was supported by, I think, Rob Reiner or some random celebrity. And he was like accused of embezzling funds from the campaign fund. And that helped to kind of tank it severely, which sounds like trivial and ridiculous, but I think it demonstrates sort of the community tension we've been talking about and the sensitivity around this sort of like tax increase. Because to me, that seems like something that should pass pretty easily, but in 2006, and I think we're seeing some of the same like libertarian tendencies right now. So I think campaigning and with just being really careful in that area. But I do think it's something worth trying, certainly. Maybe without Rob Reiner this time.
If I could also add to that, for example, in Philadelphia, there was a sugary drink tax passed a few years ago, so a form of a sin tax, and that raised money for 2,000 preschool seats. And it's not the most popular of taxes, but I think it maybe would have a better chance than a tax directly on someone's wealth or income. So some sort of sin tax, whether it's increasing cigarette tax or sugary drink tax or marijuana tax.
Stuart, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'd also add real quickly, I don't know if we remember to mention this in the presentation, but in Oregon's or Portland's universal pre-K initiative that passed, I think their county is called like Multnomah County. Part of the initiative was an increased tax on, I think, households that make over 125,000. And that money's not only going towards the universal pre-K programs themselves, but they're also using that money to create a fund that would like subsidize learning centers within the county, because I think one of us mentioned this, but one thing that unfortunately happens is in cities where universal pre-K is developed, like New York or Chicago, those programs put out of business the daycare like centers in the area as well. So what they're doing in Portland is basically creating a fund using that tax money to keep those programs going, because those are also really good programs that are serving children there. So yeah.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting. I mean, Prop 15 failed last week, but one of the competing statewide propositions that the California School Board Association was interested in putting on the ballot was a millionaire's tax. And I wonder, in light of the fact that that split roll didn't succeed, and we might see an effort statewide in a couple of years to do a millionaire's tax. And I think pre-K could be a rallying cry for that. I'm also curious, I know, and it's directly tied to funding. I mean, LA Unified has cut its program evaluation division, but in the research you did you find anything specific about LA? I mean, I know, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but at LA, we have so many, we have our TK, our ETK, we have our early ed centers, and then all the kind of CBOs, the nonprofit providers you mentioned, and this kind of interesting patchwork. And I should say another priority of mine is trying to unify the enrollment system for a lot of these, because I think you mentioned, or somebody maybe mentioned, that there's a lot of seats that aren't filled, in part because it's hard for families to navigate. But I'm just curious if there was any like LA specific research that you were able to find.
So the most LA specific research I found was a study from RAND. Obviously they're in Santa Monica, they care. It was great. It was very expansive. It's long. And honestly, it's kind of mean. Like, they really criticize LA for the underfunding, which of course, but they do make a lot of comments on this sort of patchwork idea, and the idea that once you get these different organizations subcontracted, it becomes more fluid in terms of the funding. So if you have one program that is expecting 400 students and then they only get 200, you can move some of those funds to a program that was maybe expecting 400 students and got 600. So just sort of the subcontracting can help increase that sort of fluidity of funds between the patchwork of programs. Did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's helpful too. And I'm curious, I mean, if I haven't seen a lot of research on LA specific, like the success of our ETK. I mean, one of the challenges is these are like longitudinal studies, I guess. And it's been a decade since we've cut our program evaluation team. But, you know, we're looking at, even in my district, like far from where we're going to get to universal pre-K, we're just trying to reopen early ed centers that have been shuttered for 10 years. And partially because there's not a lot of state funding, we're looking at leasing sites out to nonprofit providers. And so, you know, curious which ones are ones we should be looking at and which ones maybe we should stay away from. I have some questions on the housing, but Danielle, Avery, you have questions on the early ed piece?
This was so helpful and so timely. As Nick mentioned, you know, we're really looking at opening some shuttered sites that have been closed for decades, but really there's a need in the community. And what we're seeing is that as the demographics and the income levels of communities are changing, the income threshold is kind of a barrier to entry for some families because they may make above the threshold to qualify for California State Preschool, but may not have enough money to pay for the private preschool down the street, the French preschool that, you know, everybody wants to go to. So, you know, in thinking about kind of reopening these shuttered sites, a lot of them are way out of code and need some upgrades in order to kind of get kids in the door. Wondering if you've seen any funding opportunities for funds to help refurbish some of these existing buildings and bring them up to code, because a lot of times the cost to even get a building ready to go is, you know, a barrier to even reopening these sites. So wondering if you've seen any state funds or federal funds that help with the facilities aspects.
Yeah, so the passage of like Prop 13 way back had a really big emphasis on maintenance and sort of refurbishing of these areas. So I think it's like, this is very eligible for those funds. A lot of the state budget that's given to education goes towards this sort of maintenance and refurbishing. So maybe using some of those like maintenance funds, obviously those are being used already, but putting some of that towards universal pre-K in the name of refurbishing and maintenance, as opposed to in the name of establishing universal pre-K, could be a way to sort of navigate that. Yeah.
Great. And then another kind of question. I know that a lot of these programs, whether it be Head Start or California State Preschool or ETK and TK, have different levels of requirements for teachers, which is why the pay is, you know, so different in some of these places. Different resources and wraparound services that come with Head Start that may not come with California State Preschool or ETK. And in LA, we have a lot of students that are bilingual and may be coming to us with varying levels of English language development. Wondering if you've seen in your research any models that are best suited for our dual language students. LAUSD has a dual language pilot, and as we consider, you know, how much money we invest in expanding the pilot, would love to know if you came across any results there around servicing dual language students.
Stuart, go ahead.
Yeah, there's very loud noises taking place outside my apartment, so I hope you can hear me. Unfortunately, I don't think I came across any examples that was an example of this is an element of this pre-K program that specifically serves, you know, people that are learning English as a second language. However, I think that question kind of drives at what kind of pre-K program you're trying to create, because some pre-K programs kind of, as you know, effectively just operate as daycare, whereas other pre-K programs actually focus on cognitive benefits, such as reading ability, writing ability, and things of that nature. So I think in our research, I don't know if we wanted to make the slides too wordy, but we think that whatever pre-K program is ultimately put together in Los Angeles, it should be focused on, you know, reading and writing and language skills, because, you know, ultimately those are the ones that seem to have the most staying power within kids. And, you know, considering how many kids in Los Angeles who don't speak English as their first language, we think it's, you know, the most important skill they could develop, you know, as a young child. Just really quickly related to requirements. Another thing that I thought was interesting in Portland's initiative, and I reference Portland a lot just because it's basically the newest one, and they had the advantages of being able to look at, you know, New York and Chicago and DC, and seeing what worked there and what didn't, informing their initiative. And when it came to requirements, they require a college degree from all teachers in the program. But what's interesting about that requirement is I think they give people like 5 years to attain that degree. You know, and absent that degree, I guess they'll be kicked out of the program, but, you know, they're making sure that it's accessible for people to enter in, and you have time to get your requirements done. And even when it comes to teacher's assistants, you have to have an associate's degree, I think, to become a teacher's assistant, or yeah, an associate's degree in child development to become a teacher's assistant. But again, you know, that requirement is premised on the idea that if you don't have it at the time you join the system, you'll have it within, you know, 3 to 5 years of joining the system. So I just thought that was an interesting policy that could be considered when deciding who gets to teach and things of that nature in the program.
I'd also like
to really, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you can go ahead, sorry.
I was gonna say, that's a really good point. And I just have one more question, comment, and then I will shut up and let Danielle ask some questions. But to that point, there's a lot of work happening at the state to try to advocate around, you know, there's older folks in the profession, and what happens if we all of a sudden require, you know, a credential or a BA, and some of our oldest folks that, you know, maybe don't have that, what happens to them? So I think keeping an eye to the workforce and what that really means as we're trying to advocate for new policies is really important. And I know that there's a lot of folks doing that work now with CDE and trying to think through a career lattice for folks as they're moving through this pipeline. One more just quick question about the Oklahoma case study and potentially Washington, DC, as we're thinking about scaling, and New York as well. I know that, you know, in California, we kind of have this patchwork of quality and what does quality really mean. And there's been a lot of work over the years around our quality rating and improvement system, or QRIS, that is a hard acronym, around, you know, what programs are quality and what specific metrics are we looking at. And as things are changing, you know, the matrix changes, whatnot. Given some of these universal programs that are happening at a larger scale statewide, wondering if you've come up, you know, with any research on what quality looks like, and is there a specific matrix or scale that they're using to ensure that all programs are meeting a certain quality standard?
Yeah, there definitely is. I think it's done by the National Institute of Early Education Research, and they just listed criteria. It covers classroom size, meals, screen time, teacher's degree. So it covers like a broad range of things of what would be the most quality of universal pre-K. And based on my research, every single universal pre-K program other than Oklahoma does this patchwork of district schools, charter schools, community centers, and Oklahoma still uses those, but it's like 95% of Oklahoma's pre-K program is run out of their public schools, which I didn't find any tangible evidence to say that only running it out of public schools will improve the quality. So it doesn't really matter, and which approach is used in Oklahoma's was only implemented because of their 4s and K initiative in like a couple decades back. So that was the only reason why it's so based in public schools. But based on my research, there wasn't any tangible disparity between the quality.
If I could add on, I think based on my research, I really do believe that teacher quality is the #1 factor, which is why we put in our proposal that the teachers for the universal preschool program should get at least 90% of the pay of LAUSD K-5 teachers. And you see in New York and DC, they pay their preschool teachers the same amount as their elementary school teachers to ensure you're getting the best teachers and you're retaining them. And then when it comes to older teachers who have been there, I guess you could sort of have some sort of grandfather clause and grandfather them in.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Ashleigh and Alin said, Ashleigh was exactly right. There's this like list of 10 quality benchmarks that the Institute has created, and they all relate to things like, you know, qualified teachers, like Alin said, making sure all lead teachers have bachelor degrees, you know, a maximum class size. They have 20 students as the maximum class size. One thing that I think is interesting, I just pulled it up just because it was one of the tabs I had open. They want there to be regular site monitoring, which I think is an advantage of rolling out universal pre-K over a set period of time, is you don't have as many sites to monitor, so it makes monitoring easier. So yeah, the Institute actually has a very specific list of benchmarks that they think all universal pre-K programs should have.
Danielle, you haven't had a chance to ask anything. Do you have any thoughts?
I will ask just one question on the early ed piece so we can move to the housing piece, but thank you all so much for this. This is a really great framing too for us in our thinking about this moving forward. I think, you know, what you just mentioned, Alin, about quality teachers is really critical and something that is hard to stay focused on, but is, I think the example of what happened in Quebec is a really good reminder of that, that we could do more harm than benefit, which, you know, just personally as a parent of 2 preschool aged kids, I appreciate that reminder. And I think that's helpful for us to have. I guess one question in the proposal, you talk about housing early ed at early ed centers or at the elementary schools where we have TK programs. And I just wanted to clarify, does that mean instead of the programs that we have there now, in addition to the programs that we have, you know, our TK and our early ed centers are both, we think, doing a good job, but I'm just curious about the proposal relating to sort of where we should put these new programs to the extent we're expanding.
When it comes to the, like, when they're currently in schools, I think we were thinking that you would phase out some of the transitional kindergarten, which is obviously housed with kindergartners in elementary schools, and make room in those schools for preschool programs and sort of have them more separated. Because right now it seems like the transitional kindergarten sort of together, which we feel takes away from the quality of the preschool or of the early education.
Interesting. So it's, and I guess, this is something we've been trying to wrap our heads around. And have you seen something to suggest that the TK program is less effective than a preschool program with the same students to the extent that they're 4 years old?
I've not seen any research on LA's TK program specifically, but on most of the research I've done on when these students get the most benefits, it's from high quality preschool programs where they're on their own with focused teaching from high quality teachers once again, and in smaller classroom settings.
I'll just say Danielle has a preschooler, so this is, you know, that's probably why she was more quiet. She's just,
well, one is in TK and one is supposed to be in preschool but is at home. So
I'll say,
no, but that's interesting. You know, Nick just passed a resolution a couple months ago for the district to look at its TK programs and whether they make sense. So that's part of why I'm asking. We have not gotten the report back on that, but we know that it's something that is confusing and a little bit unclear sort of what their mission is and what their success is. So it's very timely for us to be thinking through that as well. So appreciate that.
Another metric, not necessarily of success, but I know that is on the district's mind, is around capturing enrollment. You know, so and COVID is obviously particularly challenging, but we're down 6,000 kindergartners this year compared to last year. And so, you know, I'll phrase this just as a comment because I know we want to move towards the housing piece, but I think we're also looking at these programs. If we put more pre-K programs on district campuses, does that then attract families to be retained for kindergarten? Which obviously helps with our funding because we're funded based on attendance. And so that was kind of one of the basis behind the sliding scale idea. Obviously, and as you all pointed out, not a perfect, you know, kind of a stopgap or hybrid measure, but not only a way to serve some more families in a subsidized way, but could we then get those families back? And as soon as their kids turn 5, we get state funding. And does that help the district, with its financial future? So
I'll answer this really quickly and say that
Yeah.
there are research has shown that housing UPK on elementary school campuses does increase district enrollment. So does the patchwork model of working with community-based organizations. Just sort of tying them in and putting your name out there to those students helps also increase district enrollment.
Great.
Maybe we can move we've got about 10 or 11 minutes left. So maybe move to any questions you have on the housing presentation.
Yeah, well, again, you may have already sent this to Avery, but I hope you do send us a copy of the PowerPoint because
Not just that, Nick. We actually will be sending you, each student does an 8 to 10 page policy paper for their individual portion. And we'll be, once we get them all collected and graded, we'll be sending that whole package, maybe through Avery or Danielle or whomever, just so you have all that information, because it's, unfortunately they can't put, 12 weeks of research into a 6 or 7 minute presentation. So there's actually even a lot more in there along with their sources. You'll be getting all of that.
Well, thank you. Because I did have some questions about the sources, but also, not joking that we want to share this with the, I guess one question I just had, one of the things I know when we built Selma, which is in my district, it was, majority of the tenants were LA Unified employees. And now that's not the case. And one of the tensions I know is if folks lose their job, especially with a precarious budget future, then they, not wanting them also to lose their housing. So I'm curious, with these, is district employment kind of a requirement for the ones that you've seen, or is there a phase out approach? Or if we have a family that moves in, but then because of budget cuts, we have to cut that job, the added insult of then having to lose their housing is something that I know gives me pause. So just curious kind of how districts have handled that.
Yes, so I looked at a lot of case studies, and the ones I presented were obviously the ones I felt were most important. But on the basis of employment with school district, that has been a requirement in almost all of them. The main thing that I think would change that is there has been prioritization, we've seen kind of at Selma, where 50% is prioritized so others can continue to live there. And also with the developer-driven approach, which is unlikely because in that way a developer actually approaches the school district instead of the other way around. We have seen where in Baltimore, I believe, where I think only 20% was reserved for the school district, and then the remainder was for just lower income families in general. However, when it is something where it's district-led, we have seen mostly being for school district employees.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then, you acknowledge this tension too between our projects where teachers are priced out because they're making above that AMI, but we know teachers aren't making enough to then live in those, especially my district, which is the West Side and the West Valley. And actually SB 3308 was a bill that we introduced, helped introduce and push, to do some of this. So I'm glad, appreciate you acknowledging that. Danielle, Avery, questions on I have 1 or 2 more, but questions on the housing.
I just had one. I know you mentioned the Santa Clara model, and it kind of had a phased in approach in 2002 and then again in 2009. And then it had an interesting time horizon around staying in terms of the lease. Wondering when you came across your research of some of the other models, not just the LA Unified one, do you know how long it typically takes for these developments to basically come, how long does the building take to actually be ready to go? Because I think we've heard from our district folks that it's anywhere from 5 to 7 years to get the building ready to build, develop, and then get folks into the door. So as we're thinking about potential use for district properties, wondering what's the average time it takes to develop these sites?
Right. So like you said, they tend to actually take quite a bit. So I know in Chicago, they have one hoping to open soon, but they started in 2013, which is 7 years ago. However, we have seen places where they've been a bit faster. So those places have been in Springfield, for example. We saw one open in 2015. And I think that one, I don't have the specific number, but I think it was closer to around 4 years. So it really ranges. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that although housing, like as we've presented, is very important, and an end game is we want to make sure that the students have teachers that are like high quality and like care, but it's hard to bring that approach to the community. So we have different things come up like COVID, where we have to think about what are we funding, how are we funding, and I think the spotlight kind of gets reduced to other places. So maybe that's an aspect. I didn't really research too much into why it takes so long. Yeah.
Sarah, you had your hand up.
I was looking into, well, I live near Palo Alto, and I was very familiar with like a lot of the Facebook employees saying how like, oh yeah, like I'm like our company's donating a lot of money to Palo Alto Unified School District to build affordable housing. And I feel like if you see Culverley community, I believe, it's like they were projected to take around like minimum 5 years to implement that affordable housing for teachers. And I also feel like there's that whole aspect of the region of the area that you're building the schools. Like obviously Palo Alto being very, like up there in the community, I feel like you'll get things done quicker. And also I feel like you have to examine who funds these affordable housing, like especially if you have like a high tech company or nonprofit organizations that are really credible and up there. I feel like it gets quickly done. And so, but then also I feel like with LAUSD, it is one of the biggest, unified school districts out there. So I feel like it does take LAUSD a longer time than like a very smaller unified school district, such as like Palo Alto, examining Palo Alto, or even Santa Clara, for these, I guess, unified school districts to get these affordable housing implemented quicker. Hopefully that answered.
Also, last comment, I just brought up my notes to refresh myself, but we've seen actually being the process being much quicker with developer driven. So in Pennsylvania, as well as in Baltimore, it took around 2 to 3 years after the developer purchased the land. So I think that is another aspect to consider as well.
Yeah, if you all could find a way to expedite public projects in California. So I don't know that this was an explicit question of ours, and we have prioritized building of housing because we actually have the land, and we have more land at our disposal than we do like general fund dollars. But I'm curious if you've seen other ways of getting at this, either through kind of subsidies, districts providing subsidies to employees for living expenses, or mortgage relief. I know there are some, I've been approached by some companies who have said, let us partner, let us have access to your teachers because we'll do, they cover the mortgage, for the first few years. So just curious if there are other kind of, besides building the housing, other ways to help teachers with the cost of living that you've come across.
Oh, I didn't think that was the way the question was going, but with the cost of living, I didn't really dive much into it besides housing. But I did want to mention something about certificate of participation. So it's a type of bond, I believe. I'm not very well versed in this, but at Santa Clara, we saw that it was really successful, but cost half the price it cost to build Sage. It cost $12 million. And what they did was that they used the certificate of participation, which is a type of financing where like investors purchase a share of the lease revenues. So there are definitely a lot of options out there besides LHTC or the AB 3308 bill that we've looked at. And obviously in the paper, we'll explain more, but just wanted to put it out there that there are other options as well.
That's actually how we financed our district headquarters.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Some of us are trying to sell, although that also got voted down.
I think we have time for about one more question. So whoever wants to take it, fire away. Oh, now no one will ask it because they don't want to take the last cookie on the plate. So
Avery, you got one teed up? So I guess just, and this is a little bit more of a fuzzy question that we can end on. You mentioned that community tension is one of the things that you have to struggle with on these housing projects. And that is one of the primary reasons that the item before the board on Tuesday failed. And that includes community tension with, in Nick's board district, we have 2 closed schools that have not been open for 35 years. And we've been unable to do anything with that land. So I'm curious in the research around housing, if you found any sort of strategies or best practices around that process that led to success in some places, or the failure to do led to failure in other places.
So I can go with that, and if Gloria wants to add. So I know that one big problem, I feel like you're always going to have public tension. I mean, you're always going to have haters who want to turn out the idea. And I know that that's very prevalent for Cupertino because I've had my friends, family, parents who protested saying that they don't want affordable housing in this lot of mall. And I think one of the biggest reasons is the whole idea and notion that it will bypass the CQA and that it is not healthy for the environment. And I know that that is like a big problem that can arise. And so likewise, I know that some parents who vouch for affordable housing to be implemented in Cupertino did a lot of, drew a lot of awareness by canvassing and also like posting on like Instagram or social media, saying that it is not going to harm like our community, like there's not going to be like toxic stuff that's like polluted because of building this affordable housing. And so I know that that's what Cupertino district were doing, and a lot of the parents, like PTA parents, came together to do, who are vouching for the implementation of the affordable housing. But I know that the parents who opposed the idea mainly come from a place where they were just very concerned over the idea of the environmental aspect, along with just like they didn't really like the idea of having lower income teachers being in like a community that's like very privileged.
great. Well, it sounds like we could probably continue this conversation all afternoon long, hence why the 3 of you have jobs. Obviously, a lot of work to do, but we do hope that both the presentation and the papers that you'll be getting were useful. We'll certainly give you the bank of slides, and we can afford you all the students' email addresses if you have any questions or issues. But we really want to thank you all. I think this was really, really a beneficial experience for our students, and I think for you as well. So on behalf of the Center for the Political Future, thank you so much